The clinking of crystal glasses and hushed conversations of the other diners faded into background noise as Marcus's words hit me like a physical blow. "You're absolutely worthless," he sneered, his eyes glinting with something cold and cruel. "All you do is sit around the house spending my money." I stared at him, my breath catching in my throat. The waiter appeared beside our table, oblivious to the tension simmering between us. "Are you ready to order, sir?" he asked. "Yes," Marcus said, not even glancing at me. "I'll have the filet mignon, medium rare." He turned back to me, his tone dripping with sarcasm. "And what will the little woman have?" "Something inexpensive. I'll have the lobster thermidor," I said quietly, meeting his gaze. A flicker of annoyance crossed his face. "Don't you think that's a little extravagant for someone who contributes absolutely nothing?" he asked. "I'm sure we can afford it," I replied, picking up my wine glass. The cool liquid did little to soothe the burning anger rising within me. "After all," I added, a small, tight smile playing on my lips, "you're so successful." He preened at the compliment, completely oblivious to the irony. "Of course I am," he boasted. "I work hard. Unlike some people." He gestured vaguely in my direction with his hand. The waiter returned with our appetizers, a delicate arrangement of scallops for me and oysters for Marcus. I barely tasted mine, my mind racing. "So," he said, slurping down an oyster, "Eleanor called earlier. She and Julian are coming over for dinner next weekend." "That's lovely," I replied, trying to inject some warmth into my voice. The thought of seeing my daughter and her fiancé was the only thing keeping me from completely losing my composure. "Julian's father is thinking about investing in my latest project," Marcus continued, completely ignoring my attempt at pleasantries. "This could be huge, Helen, huge." He leaned forward, his eyes gleaming. "Think of what this could mean for us. A bigger house, maybe a lot." "Yes, of course," I murmured, my gaze drifting to the diamond necklace glittering around my neck. A gift from Marcus, or rather, a gift from me to me, paid for with my own money. The irony was almost suffocating. He went on and on about his grand plans, completely unaware that the very foundation of his lavish lifestyle was built on my secret success. The house we lived in, the cars we drove, the expensive dinners we ate, all of it was funded by me, by the business I had painstakingly built from the ground up while he took all the credit. "You know, Helen," he said, interrupting his own monologue, "you should really try to make more of an effort with Julian's father, charm him a bit. It wouldn't hurt to have him on our side." "I'll keep that in mind," I replied, my voice laced with a hint of steel. The main course arrived, and we ate in relative silence. Marcus continued to hold forth on his business dealings, while I listened, my mind churning. The years of belittlement, of being dismissed as a frivolous trophy wife, washed over me. I had played the part perfectly, allowing him to bask in the illusion of his own success. But tonight, something shifted inside me. I was tired of the charade. "You know, Marcus," I said, as he finished his last bite of steak, "you've always wanted a 1967 Shelby Cobra, haven't you?" He looked up at me, surprised. "Of course, I have. It's a classic, but they're incredibly rare and ridiculously expensive." He waved his hand dismissively. "It's just a pipe dream, Helen, is it? I asked, a small smile playing on my lips. He frowned, sensing a shift in my demeanor. What are you talking about? He asked, his voice laced with suspicion. I reached into my purse and pulled out a small, velvet box. I placed it on the table in front of him. He stared at it, his brow furrowed. What's this? He asked, his voice a low rumble. Open it, I said, my voice barely above a whisper. He hesitated for a moment, then slowly opened the box. Inside, nestled in the plush velvet, lay a single, gleaming key. He picked it up, turning it over in his hand. What is this? He stammered, his eyes darting from the key to me. It's the key to your dream car, Marcus, I said, my voice gaining strength. The 1967 Shelby Cobra. It's parked outside, waiting for you. His jaw dropped. He stared at me speechless. But how? He sputtered. Let's just say, I said, standing up and smoothing down my dress. I've been a little more resourceful than you've given me credit for. I looked down at him, a sense of quiet triumph washing over me. And by the way, Marcus, about all that money you think I've been spending, I paused, letting the words hang in the air. It's mine, every last penny. I turned and walked away, leaving him sitting there, stunned into silence. The sound of my heels clicking against the marble floor echoed through the restaurant, a soundtrack to my newfound freedom. I stepped out into the cool night air, a smile playing on my lips. The game had changed, and I was finally in control. I couldn't wait to see the look on his face when he saw the car. And then, after that, well, let's just say I had a few more surprises in store for him. The crystal chandeliers of La Papillon glittered, reflecting in the polished silver of our table setting. You know, Helen, Marcus said, swirling his wine, sometimes I wonder what you actually contribute to our lives. Besides looking decorative, of course. He chuckled, a condescending sound that grated on my nerves. Julian's a lucky man, Eleanor. He's got drive, ambition. Unlike some people I could mention, he added, casting a pointed glance my way. Eleanor shifted uncomfortably in her seat, glancing at Julian, who thankfully remained diplomatically silent. Dad, she started, but I placed a hand on her arm, a silent plea to let it go. It's fine, darling, I said, forcing a smile. Your father's just being playful. The waiter arrived with our appetizers, escargots for Marcus, foie gras for myself. He picked at his dish, still muttering about Julian's latest business venture, some tech startup he'd invested in. Apparently, it's going to revolutionize online grocery shopping, Eleanor explained. I nodded politely, though my mind was elsewhere. I had a surprise of my own brewing, one that would revolutionize Marcus's perception of me. That's interesting, darling, because I just bought your dream car today. My voice was calm, even, but I saw the flicker of surprise in his eyes. What are you talking about? He asked, setting down his fork. Your dream car, Marcus. The 1967 Shelby Cobra. Guardsman blue, just like you always wanted. He stared at me, his face a mixture of disbelief and confusion. You bought a car, a Shelby Cobra, he stammered. I took a sip of my wine, letting the silence hang in the air. Indeed, I did, I said finally, setting my glass back on the table with a delicate click. It should be delivered to the house next week. Eleanor and Julian exchanged bewildered glances, clearly as stunned as Marcus. But how? He sputtered. How could you afford? I allowed a small, almost imperceptible smile to play on my lips. The waiter returned, clearing our appetizer plates. I waited until he was gone before continuing. Let's just say, Marcus, I began, my voice dropping slightly, that I have a few hobbies you're not aware of. Hobbies that have been quite lucrative. Shall we say? He opened his mouth to speak, but I held up a hand, stopping him. You see, Marcus, I continued, my voice gaining a new, steely edge, while you've been busy belittling my contributions and dismissing me as a mere decorative addition to your life, I've been building something of my own. Something rather substantial. Actually, I watched as realization slowly dawned on his face, the color draining from his cheeks. You mean, he began, his voice barely a whisper. Yes, Marcus, I said, my voice firm and clear. I've been funding this lifestyle. The house, the cars, the country club, even your precious designer suits, all of it. Paid for by me. The silence at the table was thick enough to cut with a knife. Eleanor's jaw had dropped, while Julian looked on with a mixture of fascination and apprehension. I could practically hear the gears turning in Marcus's head as he struggled to process this information. He opened his mouth several times, as if to speak, but no words came out. Finally, he managed to stammer, "But your charity work." I smiled, a genuine smile this time. Let's just say my charity work extends beyond the local animal shelter, Marcus. I picked up my wine glass again, the cool crystal a comforting weight in my hand. Now, I said, turning to Eleanor and Julian, shall we discuss something more pleasant? Perhaps Eleanor's upcoming wedding plans. I saw the flicker of fear in Marcus's eyes as I turned away from him, a fear that warmed me more than the finest champagne. He thought the Shelby Cobra was a surprise. He had no idea what was coming next. Rain lashed against the panoramic windows of the restaurant, blurring the city lights into a hazy glow. Marcus, oblivious to the downpour, continued his monologue about the idiotic investment choices of his colleagues, punctuating his points with a condescending wave of his wine glass. Honestly, Helen, he said, his voice dripping with disdain, some people just have no concept of how to handle money. I took a slow sip of my water, the ice clinking softly against the crystal. He was right. In a way, he had absolutely no idea. For over a decade, I'd played the role of the doting wife, happily accepting the lavish lifestyle he supposedly provided. He thought I was a financial burden. The truth was, I was the one carrying the weight. The waiter cleared our plates, the remnants of our perfectly seared scallops a stark contrast to the bitterness churning inside me. So, darling, Marcus drawled, swirling the last of his expensive Cabernet Sauvignon, about that country club membership renewal. He paused, expecting the usual, practiced demurral about needing to discuss the household budget. Tonight, however, would be different. Tonight, the charade ended. Marcus, I began, my voice steadier than I expected. We need to talk. He blinked, clearly taken aback by my tone. It was the first time I'd interrupted his self-congratulatory pronouncements in years. Is something wrong? He asked, a flicker of concern. perhaps even annoyance, crossing his face. "I've been meaning to tell you something for a while," I said, meeting his gaze directly. He leaned back, his expression shifting from mild concern to impatient curiosity. This was a familiar ritual. He expected a confession about a broken vase, a misplaced credit card, some minor domestic infraction. He had no idea what was coming. "Remember when I said I was taking those online courses?" I asked, watching his face carefully. A flicker of recollection crossed his features. "The ones you called a waste of time." He shifted uncomfortably, clearly not remembering the specifics, but recognizing the dismissive tone he'd likely employed. "Yes." "Well," he stammered, reaching for his wine. "Those courses," I continued, my voice gaining a subtle edge, "were in financial management and investment strategies." I paused, letting the words sink in. The color drained from his face as the implications began to dawn on him. He opened his mouth to speak, but I held up a hand, silencing him. "You see, Marcus," I said, my voice now laced with a quiet strength I hadn't realized I possessed. "I've been managing a rather substantial portfolio for quite some time. Quite successfully, in fact." His eyes widened, a mixture of confusion and disbelief swirling within them. What are you talking about?" he finally managed, his voice barely above a whisper. I reached into my purse and pulled out a small, unassuming folder. I slid it across the table towards him. He stared at it, hesitant to touch it, as if it contained some dangerous secret. "This," I said, my voice calm and measured, "is a summary of my earnings over the past 10 years. He cautiously opened the folder, his eyes scanning the figures. His face paled, his jaw slackening as he absorbed the information. The silence stretched, punctuated only by the rhythmic drumming of the rain against the windows. He looked up at me, his eyes wide with a dawning horror. This can't be right," he stammered, his voice shaking. "It is," I replied, a small, almost imperceptible smile playing on my lips. "In fact, it's a rather conservative estimate." He looked back down at the papers, his hand trembling slightly. He flipped through the pages, his breathing growing shallow. "The house," I continued, my voice gaining in confidence with each word, "the cars, the jewelry, the country club memberships, everything, all paid for by me." The blood drained from his face, leaving him ashen. He looked up at me again, his eyes filled with a mixture of shock, disbelief, and something else, fear. But how?" he stammered, his voice barely audible. "I have provided for you. I took care of everything." His words hung in the air, hollow and empty. "You thought you did," I replied, my voice soft but firm. "And I let you think that. It was convenient." I paused, taking a slow, deliberate sip of my water. The ice clinked against the glass, the sound amplified in the sudden silence. He sat there, stunned into silence, his carefully constructed world crumbling around him. The rain continued to lash against the windows, the city lights now completely obscured by the downpour. He looked like a small, lost boy caught in a storm, and as I looked at him, I felt a strange sense of not satisfaction. Not exactly. Perhaps it was closer to relief. The charade was over. The truth was out. And I was finally free. "Now, Marcus," I said, my voice steady and clear, about Eleanor's wedding. His head snapped up, a flicker of panic in his eyes. He clearly thought I was about to deliver another blow. I smiled, a genuine smile this time. I think we should discuss the venue. Julian mentioned something about a destination wedding, perhaps the Caribbean. I let the words hang in the air, watching his face as he struggled to process the sudden shift in the conversation. He opened his mouth to speak, then closed it again, his eyes darting back and forth between me and the folder on the table. The rain continued to fall, washing away the pretense, the lies, the years of carefully constructed illusions, and in the silence, I knew the real game was about to begin. Rain lashed against the windows of my tiny apartment, mimicking the storm brewing inside me. Marcus had just called, his voice dripping with condescension. "Darling, I know you mean well, but honestly, your little job is just cute. Don't worry your pretty little head about money." The memory stung, even years later. His words echoed the constant refrain of our early marriage. I was decorative, a charming accessory, not a contributor. Little did he know that while he preened and puffed, building his so-called empire, I was quietly building my own. I swirled the cheap wine in my chipped glass, the bitter taste a stark contrast to the vintage champagne we now habitually drank. Back then, every penny counted. I worked 2 jobs, juggling waitressing shifts with late nights at the library, poring over textbooks on finance and investment. Sleep was a luxury I couldn't afford. My ambition burned brighter than any exhaustion. One day, I whispered to my reflection in the darkened window, one day, he'll see. He'd see that the woman he dismissed as a frivolous ornament was the steel girder holding up his extravagant lifestyle. I'd crammed for exams in cramped, stuffy rooms, fueled by instant coffee and sheer willpower. My classmates, mostly privileged kids fresh out of prestigious schools, looked at me with a mixture of pity and amusement. "You're really going to try and make it in this world?" Helen, one of them, a smug, blazer-clad boy named Charles, had sneered. "Perhaps stick to something more suitable, like flower arranging." His words hadn't deterred me. They'd fueled me. I graduated top of my class, landing an internship at a small, but fiercely ambitious investment firm. The work was grueling, the hours long, but I thrived. I learned the language of Wall Street, the subtle dance of risk and reward. I soaked up knowledge like a sponge, eager to prove myself, not to them, but to me. The first real win came with a risky but calculated investment in a fledgling tech company. My colleagues had scoffed. "It's a gamble, Helen," my supervisor had warned. "You could lose everything." But I'd done my research. I'd seen the potential where others saw only uncertainty. My gut screamed invest, and I listened. Within months, the company's stock skyrocketed. My gamble had paid off, and not just financially. It earned me respect, a seat at the table, a voice that finally mattered. The whispers changed, the pity vanished, the amused glances transformed into something else entirely, adoration, perhaps even a touch of envy. I remember the thrill of that first big success, the feeling of validation that washed over me. It was a taste of the life I craved, a life built on my own terms, not defined by someone else's perception of me. I moved from my cramped apartment to a modest condo, then a larger one. I invested wisely, carefully building a portfolio that grew exponentially. I still worked hard, harder than ever, but now it was for me. It was about building a future where I was the architect of my own destiny. And through it all, I kept my success a secret from Marcus. Let him continue to believe his own narrative, his puffed-up self-importance fueled by ignorance. Let him think he was the provider, the king of his castle. My silence was a shield, a weapon I'd wield when the time was right. I met him at a charity gala, the kind of event he loved to attend, basking in the glow of perceived success. He was charming, charismatic, and utterly oblivious to the fact that I was funding the very lifestyle he flaunted so effortlessly. He wooed me with expensive dinners, lavish gifts, and promises of a life of luxury. I played along, the perfect trophy wife, smiling sweetly as he boasted about his latest business deal, his voice laced with the arrogance of a man who believed he'd conquered the world. "You're so lucky, Helen," he'd say, his hand resting possessively on my knee. "Most women would kill for a life like this." He had no idea how right he was. I'd worked tirelessly, sacrificed everything, to build this life, not for him, but for myself. The irony was almost delicious. And now, years later, the rain continued to beat against the windows of our opulent mansion, a stark reminder of the humble beginnings I'd left behind. I sipped a vintage port, the rich, complex flavor whirled away from the cheap wine of my past. Soon, he would know. Soon, the charade would end. And the look on his face was something I was eagerly anticipating. The first cracks in his carefully constructed facade were already starting to show. He'd been talking about a classic car, a 1967 Shelby Cobra, a symbol of success, he'd called it. He'd lamented that it was just out of reach, a pipe dream. Little did he know, it was already sitting in a climate-controlled garage, a shiny, emerald green symbol not of his success, but of mine, a symbol of my quiet revenge. Rain lashed against the windows of our small apartment, mimicking the storm brewing inside me. "You'll never amount to anything, Helen," Marcus had sneered just hours earlier, tossing his tailored jacket onto the worn sofa. "You're lucky I provide for you." His words echoed in the otherwise quiet room, a constant reminder of my supposed inadequacy. I swallowed the lump in my throat, a familiar ache settling in my chest. I plastered a smile on my face and offered him a drink. "Long day, darling?" I asked, my voice trembling slightly. He grunted in response, flipping through the channels on our tiny, second-hand television. That was a common refrain in those early years of our marriage. Common and deeply wounding. I kept my head down, focusing on the mundane tasks of running our household, cooking, cleaning, organizing. "Dinner will be ready soon," I announced, trying to inject some warmth into the chilly atmosphere. He barely acknowledged me, engrossed in a football game. The illusion had to be maintained, the facade of a doting, dependent wife. Inside, though, a quiet resolve began to harden. I knew my worth. I knew my capabilities. He just couldn't see them yet. Or, more accurately, he refused to. Marcus had a carefully constructed image of himself, the successful businessman, the provider, the man in charge. My true potential threatened that image, so he dismissed it, belittled it, pretended it didn't exist. Every morning, I would meticulously prepare his breakfast, toast, and coffee just the way he liked it. "Thank you, Helen," he'd say, his tone almost an afterthought, already scanning the newspaper for the latest stock prices. He'd then leave for the office, his briefcase swinging, the very image of a self-made man. What he didn't know was that while he was at the office building his empire, I was building mine. I'd slip out of our modest apartment, not to the shops or the salon as he assumed, but to the small, unassuming office I rented downtown. There, I poured my energy and intellect into my own ventures, the ones I kept meticulously hidden from him. I had to be discreet. Any hint of my own success would only fuel his resentment. The charade was elaborate, exhausting, but necessary. I carefully deposited just enough cash into our joint account to cover our modest living expenses. "We're a little short this month, Marcus," I'd say, feigning concern. He'd puff up his chest, lecture me on frivolous spending, and then, almost performatively, write a check to cover the shortfall. He thought he was the provider. He reveled in that role. He never suspected that the money he so grandly provided was, in fact, a small fraction of what I was earning. He never suspected the shortfall was a carefully calculated maneuver to keep him feeling superior. Evenings were spent playing the part of the supportive wife, listening to his endless monologues about deals and clients, nodding and offering the occasional, well-placed question. "That sounds challenging, darling," I'd murmur, suppressing a smile. He'd beam, pleased with my apparent interest and admiration. Sometimes, late at night, after he'd fallen asleep, I would sit by the window, looking out at the city lights. The small, cramped apartment felt like a gilded cage. I yearned for more, not just materially, but emotionally. I craved recognition, not just for the role I played, but for the person I truly was. I remember one particularly difficult evening. We were having dinner with some of his colleagues, all men in expensive suits, and their impeccably dressed wives. Marcus, fueled by several glasses of wine, held court, boasting about his latest business triumph. He glanced at me dismissively. "Helen takes care of the domestic side of things," he announced, his tone implying that my contributions were insignificant. The other wives, all seemingly content in their roles as decorative accessories, murmured their agreement. I felt a surge of anger, a burning resentment. But I maintained my composure. I smiled politely, played the dutiful wife. Inside, however, the seeds of rebellion were taking root. I continued to play the role of the dependent spouse, carefully nurturing Marcus's inflated ego while secretly building my own empire. It was a delicate balancing act, a constant tightrope walk. One wrong step, one slip of the tongue could expose everything, but I was meticulous, patient, and driven by a deep, burning desire to prove him wrong, to show him and the world that I was more than just the woman he thought I was. The rain continued to fall, the rhythmic drumming against the windowpane a soundtrack to my quiet resolve. I knew my time would come. I knew that one day I would reveal the truth, and the look on his face would be worth all the years of silent struggle. I just needed the right opportunity, the right moment, the right stage to unveil my masterpiece. Rain lashed against the windows of our living room, a dramatic backdrop to the quiet fury simmering within me. It had been 5 years since Marcus had sneered. You contribute nothing to this family, Helen. You're lucky I tolerate you. I traced the rim of my teacup, the porcelain cool against my fingertips, a stark contrast to the heat in my chest. I looked around the opulent room, at the plush velvet sofas, the antique Persian rug, the glistening chandelier that cast dancing shadows on the polished mahogany floor. Marcus, I said, my voice steady, have you ever wondered how we afford all this? He glanced up from his newspaper, a flicker of annoyance in his eyes. Don't be absurd, Helen. You know I handle the finances. He rustled the paper dismissively, a clear signal that the conversation was over. But for me, it was just beginning. I set down my teacup, the gentle clink echoing in the sudden silence. Yes, I said, meeting his gaze directly. I know you think you handle the finances. A flicker of something perhaps unease crossed his face. What's that supposed to mean? It means, Marcus, I said, rising to my feet, the expensive silk of my dress whispering against my legs, that it's time you learned a few things about your wife. I crossed to the large bay window, watching the rain cascade down the glass, blurring the manicured lawns and sculpted hedges of our estate. This house, I began, my voice low and even, it's in my name. He scoffed. Don't be ridiculous. I turned back to him, a small, almost imperceptible smile playing on my lips. The deed is in the safe. Feel free to check. I paused, letting the silence hang heavy in the air before continuing. And the cars, I gestured vaguely towards the garage, where his prized Mercedes and my own understated sedan resided. Those are mine too. He stared at me, his face a mask of disbelief. You're lying. Am I challenged, my voice laced with steel. The titles are also in the safe, along with the documentation for the country club membership, the investment portfolios. And, oh yes, I added, almost as an afterthought, the jewelry. I ran a hand over the diamond pendant at my throat, a piece he'd proudly gifted me on our anniversary, completely oblivious to the fact that I'd already purchased it myself weeks before. He was speechless, his mouth opening and closing like a fish out of water. Finally, he managed to stammer. But how, I echoed, raising an eyebrow. I work, Marcus. I have a career. I saw the confusion swirling in his eyes, the realization that the woman he'd dismissed as a frivolous ornament was, in fact, the architect of their entire lavish lifestyle. A very successful one, I added, enjoying the stunned silence that followed. You've been working? He asked, his voice barely above a whisper. He looked around the room again, as if seeing it for the first time, the weight of my revelation slowly sinking in. All this time you've been supporting us. I finished for him, my voice smooth and even. Yes, Marcus. All this time, I watched as the color drained from his face, his carefully constructed facade of control crumbling before my eyes. He opened his mouth to speak, but no words came out. I built a software company, Marcus. I revealed, deciding to twist the knife just a little bit further, from the ground up, while you were busy playing golf and attending those endless business dinners. I was building an empire. I paused, letting the gravity of my words sink in. A multi-million-dollar empire, Marcus. One that you knew absolutely nothing about. The rain continued to beat against the windows, the rhythmic drumming a fitting soundtrack to the storm raging within our home. He looked at me, his eyes filled with a mixture of disbelief, confusion, and something else fear. He finally found his voice, though it was weak and unsteady. "But why didn't you tell me? You never asked," I replied simply. "And besides," I added, a hint of steel creeping back into my voice, "I rather enjoyed watching you preen and posture, taking all the credit for a life you didn't build, a life you didn't earn." I paused, letting the silence hang heavy between us. "I think," I said finally, a slow smile spreading across my face, "it's time I started enjoying the fruits of my labor. Don't you agree, Marcus?" He didn't answer, his gaze fixed on the floor, his face a mask of shame and defeat. I turned back towards the window, the rain now easing, a sliver of sunlight breaking through the clouds. Tomorrow, I would show him just how much I had been enjoying the fruits of my labor. Tomorrow, I would deliver the final blow, a masterpiece of sweet revenge that he wouldn't soon forget. And as I looked out at the clearing sky, I couldn't help but feel a sense of anticipation, a quiet thrill at the prospect of what tomorrow would bring. The game, Marcus, had just begun. The ballroom shimmered, a kaleidoscope of glittering gowns and crisp tuxedos. It was the annual Children's Hospital Gala, 3 years before Marcus even knew my name. I surveyed the room, a soft smile playing on my lips. The floral arrangements, breathtaking in their scale and artistry, were mine. Not in the sense that I'd wandered through a florist shop and picked them out, no. I owned the florist, and the catering company responsible for the exquisite hors d'oeuvres circulating on silver trays, also mine. In fact, a significant portion of this extravagant event, from the champagne flutes to the string quartet serenading the guests in the corner, was made possible through my quiet contributions. I preferred it that way. The satisfaction came not from public acknowledgement, but from knowing I was making a difference. A hand touched my arm. "Helen, darling, you've outdone yourself again," a warm voice said. It was Elizabeth, the chair of the gala committee. She'd become a dear friend over the years, one of the few who knew the extent of my involvement. "It's a pleasure, Elizabeth," I replied, my gaze sweeping over the happy faces. "Seeing these children smile makes it all worthwhile. You're an angel, Helen." Elizabeth squeezed my arm. "Truly, I don't know what we'd do without you." She lowered her voice slightly. "Between you and me, half these people wouldn't give a dime if it wasn't for the social climbing opportunities." I chuckled softly. Let them have their illusions, as long as the children benefit. A hush fell over the room as the auctioneer took the stage. I settled into my chair, content to observe. I'd already made my anonymous donation, a hefty sum that would ensure the hospital could purchase a much-needed piece of equipment. The bidding wars that ensued were entertaining, though a fascinating display of competitive philanthropy. Suddenly, a voice boomed from the back of the room. $100,000. Heads turned. A tall, imposing man with salt and pepper hair strode towards the stage, a confident smirk on his face. It was Marcus. He exuded an aura of wealth and power, captivating the attention of everyone in the room. The auctioneer, clearly impressed, began to gush. $100,000 from Mr. Marcus Blackwood. Do I hear 110? 115. The bidding stalled. No one dared to challenge Marcus. He seemed to relish the spotlight. His chest puffed out with pride. The auctioneer, sensing the finality of the moment, raised his gavel. Going once, going twice. 120,000, I said, my voice clear and steady. The room erupted in murmurs. Marcus whipped round, his eyes locking onto mine. For a moment, I thought I saw a flicker of surprise, perhaps even annoyance, in their depths. He approached me, a charming smile plastered on his face. Well, well, he purred. It seems we have a competitor. I'm Marcus Blackwood. He extended a hand. Helen, I replied simply, shaking his hand. My heart pounded in my chest, but my expression remained neutral. Helen, he repeated, savoring the sound of my name. A woman of exquisite taste, I see, not only in her philanthropic endeavors, but also in her ability to challenge a man like myself. I merely believe the children deserve our utmost support, I said, my gaze unwavering. He chuckled. Admirable. Tell me, Helen, what do you do that allows you to make such generous contributions? I have a few business interests. I replied vaguely. I wasn't ready to reveal the full extent of my wealth, not yet. He leaned in closer, his eyes twinkling. Intriguing. Perhaps we could discuss these interests over dinner sometime. Perhaps, I said, a hint of a smile playing on my lips. Even then, I knew this man, with his insatiable ego and thirst for recognition, would be the perfect target. He saw me as a charming, philanthropic woman, a potential conquest. He had no idea the power I truly held, the resources at my disposal. He saw a woman who might enhance his image. He didn't see the woman who would ultimately dismantle it. The seed of my revenge was planted that night, watered by his arrogance and nurtured by my quiet resolve. The game had begun, and I, the silent benefactor, was finally ready to play. He wanted to know about my interests, my business. Oh, he would learn in due time. He would learn everything. The crisp air of the auction house felt like a slap in the face that evening. You wouldn't understand these things, Helen, Marcus had said, waving me away from a vintage Rolex. Stick to what you know. He'd patted my hand, a condescending gesture that made my stomach churn. But I smiled politely, the mask I'd perfected over the years firmly in place. I let him think he knew best, let him believe his pronouncements were gospel. It was easier that way. Besides, I had other things to occupy my mind. Like the string of numbers I'd just memorized the account number for a newly established Swiss bank account. The years that followed were a blur of Marcus's escalating ego and my carefully cultivated silence. He bought a yacht, bragging to anyone who would listen about his savvy investments. Another win, darling, he'd announce, pouring himself a scotch. We're truly blessed. I'd simply smile and offer him a coaster, the irony twisting inside me like a knife. He thought he was brilliant, a financial wizard. He had no clue that the blessed life he flaunted was entirely my creation, built on the back of my silent successes. There was the trip to Aspen, where Marcus held court at the lodge, boasting about the ski-out chalet he'd secured, prime real estate. He'd declared to Eleanor and Julian over Aper's ski drinks. Only the best for my family. I remember catching Eleanor's eye, a flicker of something I couldn't quite decipher passing between us. I sipped my hot chocolate, the warmth doing little to thaw the ice in my veins. He was so proud, so utterly oblivious. Then there was the time he surprised Eleanor and Julian with a down payment on a house in the Hamptons. A little something to help them get started, he'd said, puffing out his chest. A father's duty, wouldn't you say, Helen? I agreed, of course, even as I mentally calculated the transfer I'd made to cover the gift. The charade was exhausting, the constant performance draining, but the thought of the endgame kept me going. His obsession with the 1967 Shelby Cobra started subtly. A magazine article left carelessly on the coffee table. A casual mention of a classic car show. It grew into a full-blown fixation, the car becoming a symbol of the success he believed he'd achieve, the pinnacle of automotive engineering. He'd declare, eyes gleaming, a true masterpiece. He'd spend hours online, poring over specs and auction listings. He'd even started wearing a Shelby Cobra baseball cap, a ridiculous accessory that I secretly found amusing. Imagine owning one of those beauties, Helen, he'd say, a wistful sigh escaping his lips. A dream, really, I'd nod. A plan slowly taking shape in my mind. A plan involving a discreet phone call to a specialist car dealer I'd met at a charity gala. Dreams can come true, Marcus, I'd murmur, a cryptic smile playing on my lips. He just chuckled, dismissing my words as empty pleasantries. He had no idea. Over the years, I'd learned to navigate his world, to anticipate his desires, to play the role of the supportive, if slightly dim-witted, wife. I'd attended countless business dinners, smiling politely while he monopolized conversations, taking credit for deals I'd orchestrated behind the scenes. I'd endured his patronizing comments about my lack of business acumen, his casual dismissals of my opinions. You wouldn't understand, Helen, he'd say, a familiar refrain that echoed in my ears. But all the while, I was building my own empire, a silent testament to my strength and resilience. And the Shelby Cobra, that was just the cherry on top, the perfect symbol of my quiet triumph. The arrangements were complex, requiring multiple shell corporations and offshore accounts. I worked meticulously, ensuring every detail was perfect, every contingency accounted for. The car was located, authenticated, and purchased. It was shipped discreetly, stored in a private garage, waiting for the right moment to make its grand entrance. And as the date of Marcus's upcoming birthday approached, I knew the time was finally right. The stage was set. The game was about to begin. Patience. Helen, I whispered to myself, a thrill of anticipation coursing through my veins. Patience. He wouldn't know what hit him. The gavel slammed down. Sold to the lady in red for $2 million. The auctioneer's voice boomed through the cavernous hall. A ripple of murmurs followed. $2 million. That was more than double the estimated price for the pristine 1967 Shelby Cobra, the exact model Marcus had obsessed over since he was a boy. $2 million for a car. He had scoffed just last week when I'd shown him an online listing. Utterly ridiculous. Money doesn't grow on trees. Helen, he never understood how right he was. It didn't grow on trees. It grew in my investment portfolio. I allowed myself a small, private smile as the auction house staff directed me to finalize the paperwork. $2 million wasn't pocket change, even for me. But seeing Marcus's face when he realized this magnificent machine, this symbol of his boyhood dreams, was mine that was priceless. The legal formalities were swift, my lawyers having prepared everything in advance. As I signed the final document, I could almost feel the weight of the years of his condescension lifting from my shoulders. "Congratulations, madam," the auction house manager said, shaking my hand. "A truly remarkable acquisition." "Thank you," I replied, my voice steady and calm. "It's a gift." I didn't elaborate. Let him assume it was for some faceless admirer. The truth was far more satisfying. This car, this extravagant purchase, was my declaration of independence, a monument to my own hard work and silent success. The years of being dismissed as a mere trophy wife were over. The next step was arranging delivery. I instructed the staff to have the Cobra transported not to our home, but to a private garage I owned, one Marcus knew nothing about. This wasn't just about the car. It was about control, about rewriting the narrative he'd crafted about my life, our life. Everything must be perfect, I told the transport manager, down to the last detail. He assured me it would be. I spent the rest of the day making arrangements. The unveiling had to be just right. Not flashy, not ostentatious, but quietly devastating. I wanted to see the realization dawn in his eyes, the slow, creeping understanding that he had fundamentally misjudged me, underestimated me for years. "Eleanor, darling," I said, calling my daughter, "could you and Julian join Marcus and me for dinner tomorrow night? I have a surprise I'd like to share." "Of course, Mom," Eleanor replied. "What's the occasion?" "Let's just say it's a celebration," I said, a hint of steel in my voice. Eleanor didn't press further. She knew me well enough to recognize that tone. There was something significant brewing, and she was intrigued. The following evening, Marcus was in particularly fine form, holding court at the dinner table, boasting about a recent business deal. He patted my hand condescendingly. "See, Helen," he said, "this is what real success looks like." I simply smiled, letting him bask in his perceived glory. It was almost time. After dinner, I suggested we step out for some fresh air. "I have something I want to show you all," I said, leading them towards the garage I'd rented just for this occasion. Marcus looked puzzled. "What is it?" "Helen, some new garden gnomes." He chuckled at his own wit. I didn't respond. I simply pressed the button on the garage door opener. The door rumbled upwards, revealing the gleaming Shelby Cobra bathed in the soft glow of strategically placed spotlights. Marcus stared, his jaw slack. He took a hesitant step forward, then another, as if drawn in by some unseen force. He reached out a trembling hand to touch the polished hood. This is," he stammered, unable to complete the sentence. "Yours," I said softly. The look on his face was a mixture of disbelief, confusion, and a flicker of something else, fear. He finally turned to me, his eyes questioning. "But how?" "I bought it," I replied, my voice calm and even. "Just like I bought this house, and the cars, and everything else we have." I paused, letting the words sink in. "For years, Marcus, you've dismissed me, belittled me, assumed I was nothing more than a pretty face. You thought you were the provider, the breadwinner. You were wrong. I pulled a small, leather-bound notebook from my purse and handed it to him. This is my portfolio, Marcus. It contains the details of my investments, my businesses, my earnings. Everything you never bothered to ask about. Everything you assumed I was incapable of. He flipped through the pages, his face paling with each turn. Eleanor and Julian exchanged stunned glances. They had no idea. Nobody did. I'd played the role of the dutiful wife perfectly, all while building my own empire in secret. I've quietly funded our lifestyle for years. Marcus, I continued, my voice rising slightly. Every luxury, every comfort, every indulgence paid for by me. And this, I gestured towards the cobra. This is just a small token of my appreciation for the years of your encouragement. The silence that followed was thick with unspoken words. Marcus finally looked up, his eyes filled with a mixture of shame and awe. He opened his mouth to speak, but no words came out. He looked from me to the car and back again, the realization of the depth of his misjudgment hitting him like a physical blow. I smiled. Now, Marcus, I said, turning to walk away, shall we go for a drive? The purr of the Cobra's engine filled the air, a powerful symphony of my liberation. The muted clinking of silverware against fine china filled the air of the exclusive restaurant. You know, Helen, Marcus began, swirling his wine. Sometimes I wonder what you actually do all day. Besides shopping, of course. He smiled, a condescending glint in his eye. It's a good thing I can provide so well for you and Eleanor. I took a slow, deliberate sip of my own wine, letting his words hang in the air between us like a noxious fume. Marcus, I finally replied, my voice even and calm. There's something you need to know. He raised an eyebrow. Oh, he asked, a hint of amusement in his voice. Are you finally going to reveal the secret ingredient in your famous sofo? I met his gaze, a small smile playing on my lips. Not quite, I said. It's something a little bigger than that. I gestured to the waiter, who had been discreetly hovering nearby. Could you bring us the dessert menu, please? As the waiter placed the menus before us, I reached into my handbag and retrieved a small, velvet box. Marcus's eyes flicked towards it, curiosity replacing his amusement. What's that? He asked, his tone cautious. Dessert, I replied, pushing the box across the table towards him. He opened it slowly, his face paling as he recognized the contents. Inside, nestled on a bed of satin, was a Kia car key specifically. A key to a 1967 Shelby Cobra. Where did you get this? He stammered, his eyes wide with disbelief. That is impossible. He knew how much he'd always wanted that car, a vintage masterpiece he'd only ever dreamed of owning. It's yours, Marcus, I said softly. Happy anniversary. His anniversary gift to me had been a diamond tennis bracelet. Beautiful, yes, but also a symbol of what he saw me as. A decorative accessory. He stared at the key, then back at me, confusion swirling in his eyes. But how? He asked, still bewildered. These cars are worth a fortune. I know, I replied, taking another sip of wine, enjoying the moment. This particular one is in pristine condition. It even has the original racing stripes. I could see the gears turning in his head, trying to reconcile the reality before him with the image he had constructed of me. "Helen," he began, his voice laced with a sudden nervousness. Are you having an affair?" I laughed, a genuine, unforced laugh that startled him. "No, Marcus," I said, shaking my head. "I'm not having an affair." I paused, letting the silence hang heavy in the air. "I'm having a career." His brow furrowed. "A career? But what kind of career?" "A successful one," I replied, leaning forward. "One that has allowed me to, shall we say, accumulate a certain amount of wealth." I watched as his face went through a series of emotions: confusion, disbelief, then a dawning horror. "What are you saying?" he finally managed to ask, his voice barely a whisper. "I'm saying," I said, my voice firm and clear, "that everything we have, Marcus, this house, the cars, Eleanor's education, those expensive holidays you love so much, all of it has been funded by me." He stared at me speechless. The blood drained from his face, leaving him looking pale and shaken. The carefully constructed facade of the successful businessman, the provider, the man in control, began to crumble before my eyes. "For years, Marcus," I continued, "you've belittled me, underestimated me, treated me like some sort of ornament. You thought I was a financial burden, a frivolous wife who spent her days shopping and gossiping. You thought I was dependent on you." I paused, letting the weight of my words sink in. "But the truth is, Marcus, you've been dependent on me." He opened his mouth to speak, but no words came out. He looked around the restaurant, at the opulent surroundings, the other diners, as if seeing them for the first time. "This restaurant," I said, gesturing around us, "this meal, even the clothes you're wearing, all paid for by me." He finally found his voice, but it was weak and shaky. "Your art classes, your charity work, a convenient cover," I replied with a shrug, "a way to explain my absences, my hobbies. While you were busy playing the part of the successful entrepreneur, I was building a real empire." I watched as the realization of the truth finally hit him, the full force of it knocking the wind out of him. He looked down at the car key in his hand, then back up at me, his eyes filled with a mixture of shame and awe. "The Shelby Cobra," I said, my voice softening slightly. "It's just a small token of my appreciation for all the entertainment you've provided over the years." He didn't respond. He just sat there, stunned into silence, the key to his dream car clutched tightly in his hand, a symbol not of his success, but of my own. The dessert menu lay forgotten on the table between us, a stark reminder of the sweetness of this particular revenge. I picked up my wine glass, the cool crystal a comforting weight in my hand. "Now," I said, raising my glass in a silent toast, "shall we talk about the divorce settlement?"